I think that like learning pretty early on in my career how precarious the job world is, especially in the arts, really solidified even more so kind of my desire to really bolster my personal practice, because that's what's always going to be there, you know, when other things happen.
Thank you, Emma, so much for making time to speak with me today. I appreciate it a lot, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about the work that you do.
Thank you so much for having me.
I was thinking about how to introduce you because I know that you do, or my sense from your website is that you do product and food photography, and the food photography is really gorgeous. A lot of it's stunning. And then there's also an element of taxidermy. So I'll let you start talking about the work that you do. We'll take it from here.
Sounds great. Yeah, thank you. There are kind of two prongs of what I've been doing for a while now. And there's the commercial and the editorial work, doing food photography and product photography for editorial outlets and clients. And then there's my personal work. For a long time, I was making still life photographs of food. And now I've kind of transitioned to natural history and taxidermy specimens and objects. So my website is definitely in an in-between phase right now, where it's sort of trying to represent these two different sides of my practice, and a new website to kind of highlight how they are different and, you know, and how they interact with each other is in order. But you know how websites go.
Always lagging behind the work itself, and the work is more important. So that's fine. That's great.
Yes. Yeah.
Where did the taxidermy, how did that come about, that new aspect of your work?
Since I've been making still life photographs, I've found myself really kind of fixated on this area of kind of beauty and repulsion, you know, at the same time as it exists in food and in the natural world. And when I was making my still life photographs of food, I was always, you know, interested in the food that was like rotting, or, you know, like that point in a meal where everything's been eaten and it's just the scraps and leftovers and that kind of thing. And the longer I was thinking about this sort of in-between point of ripe and rot and that kind of thing, I started looking at taxidermy dioramas in natural history museums, which kind of goes back to childhood for me, because my dad is a biologist and he's always had his office at the college he teaches is in a small natural history museum. So I've been looking at taxidermy my whole life, and at some point it kind of clicked that a taxidermy diorama is a still life tableau in a way. Its origins and its purposes are slightly different than, say, like a Dutch still life painting. But I got really curious about photographing these dead animals that are made to look alive, and sort of the visual things that happen in a habitat diorama and that kind of thing. So it's proven to be very rich territory that I think I can spend a lot of time on.
And the results are quite dramatic. So on your website, for example, I think, is it Glass Eyes Stare Back?
Yes.
And the sort of the title piece is a bird who's lost his head, so he's decapitated. I think that's the title. So there's a lot of drama in the stories that you tell. Where does that come from?
I make all my photographs for the most part with a 4x5 film camera. So I am using kind of a dramatic piece of equipment, and I have a lot of space to work with. So I'm always kind of setting up my camera and then building these scenes to kind of fill the image area I have to work with. Something I've been thinking about in relation to the taxidermy work, and thinking about how we make pictures of the natural world. And I'm thinking a lot about like the Hudson River painting tradition and these sort of sublime views of nature, kind of painting it in a way that's more dramatic than it exists in real life. I think that taxidermy does that as well, where we're taking like the most accurate representation of a species, maybe the most beautiful specimen that someone has hunted or something like that, and we're mounting it, in its most dramatic form. So there's all these ways we dramatize nature for our own pleasure and interests and things like that. And I'm hoping to be kind of critical of that in this project. Nature is not, is maybe more mundane or more damaged than we often think about or see. So I'm curious to pull on a lot of different like representations of the way we viewed landscapes and animals and kind of think about those things.
Oh, that's really interesting. So I haven't thought enough about that, but just about our relationship to animals and birds and nature and the way that we typically display those things for people to look at is a story. We create stories about them. So you're creating a different kind of story, calling out the fact that maybe we aggrandize or we blow up or we do something to make it more. I guess like you were saying about the painting tradition, just more drama or more connection. I don't know than might otherwise be there. Like maybe they're just doing their thing and they don't want to interact with us at all, but that we create these tableaus to make stories between us.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And a lot of times those stories can be productive and educational and good. And then I think sometimes we can also tell ourselves stories that maybe are harmful. Something I think a lot about with this subject matter is, how we introduce nature to kids. And I think I got a lot of like science education when I was a really young kid. And a lot of that was through taxidermy and going to local natural history museums. And when I was young, a lot of the stories were these are the animals that exist around us. I grew up on coastal Maine. So these are the habitats of coastal Maine. And these are the animals you might see out in the woods. And now going back to some of those same museums I went to as a really young person, the animals are still there, but the plaques and the writing has changed to say more, like these are some of the species that are native to this area, but are disappearing and you might not see them if you go out in the woods. So I think we're at this interesting point of changing a lot of the narratives that we have been telling ourselves for a long time, and I think it'll continue. So I'm interested in that as well with this project.
Oh, interesting. Just on a practical note, where do you get your specimens that you use in your photos?
So far, I've been going to different museums and mostly the small local museums. I haven't gone to like the New York Natural History Museum because they have, some more red tape than some of the more local ones.
They might not want you cutting the heads off their birds.
Yeah.
That might draw the line there.
Exactly. So I've been interested in taxidermy that exists in these institutions. And the image that you've been talking about with the decapitated head, that was a specimen kind of from like the back storage room that is in disrepair. And I've found that I've been really drawn to the specimens that are sort of shabbier, maybe made a long time ago, 100 years ago, that are not quite as convincing, maybe. And I think there's something that happens with taxidermy that's sort of falling apart where it's like dying its second death. Then I think that that's really interesting to look at from a photographic standpoint. But yeah, I mean, taxidermy is so ubiquitous, I'm learning. Everyone has an uncle with like a house full of mounted deer heads and that kind of thing. And I've really so far stayed within the museums and I haven't really explored taxidermy that are like hunting trophies or that kind of thing. That feels really different to me. So I'm still in the phase of trying to talk to a lot of museum curators and try to let them give me some access and that kind of thing.
What do you tell them? How do you describe your project to them?
Well, let's see. The first museum I went to was the one where my dad has, this connection with his work. So they were pretty open to me coming in because they knew who I was. And then once I had some images, I kind of show, these curators the images I'm making, and I emphasize that I, understand that taxidermy often has chemicals that are, unsafe. So I know to like bring rubber gloves and that kind of thing. But luckily, I've found some people who are accustomed to artists reaching out. There's definitely a tradition of photographers photographing taxidermy. So I think a lot of people are familiar, especially in Maine. Rosamund Purcell is an artist who's worked a lot in New England. So a lot of natural history people really know and love her work. And I like to, reference the people that I'm, trying to kind of work within a similar world. But now I just started grad school, and the program that I'm studying in, there's at University of New Mexico, there's an amazing what is it called? It's more of like a research collection. The Museum of Southwest Biology has an incredible collection of preserved animals, and they're very accustomed to artists in this program coming and working there. So some are more challenging to get access to than others.
That's great. And I realized I kind of like honed right in on the taxidermy part because I just found it so interesting when I was looking at your work. But maybe I could take a step back now and just ask you what started you off on a career in art?
Yeah, yeah. I was always, a kid making a lot of art, a lot of, all the time. And I did a lot of different things for a while. I did ballet for a long time, and I played violin, and, I was always, doing something. And then the older I got, photography was just kind of the thing that stuck, that I, was sort of endlessly interested in continuing. And my dad, who's the biologist, he's a pretty avid nature photographer. So I was always kind of, helping him, make photos of lizards and things like that he would use to then teach class before we had like Google image search and that kind of thing. So when I was looking at colleges, I knew I really wanted to go to a school where there was like a robust photography program. And I ended up at Bard College, where I studied photography. And the photography program at Bard is separate from the studio art program. So I was really immersed in photography and kind of honed in pretty quickly at that point. But yeah, I mean, I fell in love with working in the darkroom and, shooting film and like the analog part of it. That's always been the part of photography that I've been really hesitant to set aside for digital, even though there's a lot of good reasons now to set it aside for digital. I'm still kind of holding on to the analog part of it. And Bard being not far from New York, when I graduated, I moved to New York in the hopes of doing photography, in both my own personal work and in the commercial sense in New York. So I was there for a while. And yeah, and now I just think of it as kind of like my tool, to kind of explore these ideas that I'm really curious and kind of, doing more research and that kind of thing. So that's how I ended up, at the taxidermy. The still life photography process has sort of been this kind of form that I keep using, that I think I will continue to use as I explore different subject matter.
Why food photography? How did that happen?
I found myself in college, always going back to photographing my food. I also have always worked in bakeries and that kind of thing. I worked in a bakery for a really long time in high school and college, and I'm kind of like an amateur baker. So I was always, my hands were always in food, and I get a lot of creativity in baking and things like that. So I think that's kind of how I found the material in the first place. And I got really obsessed with Dutch still life painting as well, and the way that food is depicted in these really incredible tableaus, kind of going back to like the sublime painting and that kind of thing. So I ended up doing my senior thesis on making these still life photographs of food, and I was reading a lot of gastronomy writing, MFK Fisher, and referencing like like vintage cookbooks from the 70s when, color food photography was at a very kind of weird saturated point. So yeah, I think, with the baking and the Dutch still life painting, I was always interested in that point where like food goes from delicious to maybe kind of viscerally unappealing, and kind of where that line is.
So I guess there is that, and you talked about it at the beginning, that overlap between the point at which the food is just beginning to go bad or to rot or go past where we could eat it, and then also taxidermy, same thing. You prefer the shabbier pieces, the older pieces, the pieces that are sort of experiencing a second death. What is that story about for you, where those things have passed into their stages of decay?
Yeah. I've always found that I've been interested in exploring what's beneath the surface, or the things that we might not really want to talk about as much. It's kind of my way of like looking a little deeper and a little further. And yeah, I mean, I remember working at a bakery in Maine where I was like making blueberry pies, and the task was to make really beautiful pies. And while I was doing that, I was kind of also like looking at the compost pile growing throughout the day. And I was equally interested in kind of like the gross scraps we were throwing away, and how beautiful mold can be blooming on, a piece of fruit or that kind of thing. So I've always been kind of looking for the kind of the things that make me look twice, or kind of evoke uncomfortable sensations. And now, the longer I've been doing this, it more feels like the way that I kind of process the reality of death, that is as much a part of things as life, and ripeness is also the rot and the decay. And it just feels more like, sometimes it feels kind of like therapy.
When I listen to you and I look at your work, there's kind of what I can see like a natural connection to physical vulnerability, where things are decaying and rotting and dying. But I'm wondering if you think explicitly about vulnerability in your work, if that's a piece of it or not.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think about vulnerability all the time in a way. And I think about it a lot, with that piece of like the death and decay and rot, and even, making choices in my personal work to deal with that subject matter, versus I could just be making really beautiful photos that would be probably more sellable, And there's been so many points where I have chosen to go down this path of thinking about these maybe more difficult, or, less popular topics. But it always feels like the thing I need to do. So then I also think a lot about vulnerability in the ways I've kind of built my career, and my choice to leave behind the work I was doing and go back to grad school, and these choices that I make to kind of pursue the things that no one's asking me to pursue but myself.
That's great. Actually, you sort of answered a question I was going to ask you, because I was thinking as you were talking earlier too about the two sides of your practice. So you have your personal and you have the work that you do for clients, I'm assuming. So the food product photography is more that, and where you find that balance. But it sounds like the scales are tipping at the moment, if you've gone back to grad school, towards your personal work, and you're leaving aside for now the client work. Is it a sole focus on yours?
Yeah. It's been it hasn't been so intentional. It's I'm definitely figuring that part of it out. Ideally, I would just have like 35 hours a day to do everything I want to do, but time is a big constraint. So I would say for the past few years I was doing a lot of client work. I was living in New York, and then I moved to Philadelphia, and I was commuting to New York to do client work, and I was getting a ton of excitement out of that, because it was, not everything, but some things were really fun projects, and I got to work with amazing people. But I also found that while I was doing that, this urge to make my personal work was not going away. And I was feeling like I didn't have the bandwidth to do both as much as I would like to. And I also think because I was doing the food photography and the product photography, um, where I was satisfying that urge to make really beautiful things. Then it was in the personal work that I felt more urgency to dig into the less beautiful things, the more grotesque things. So I think that the fact that I was doing this as a day job then sort of has sent my personal work on this other direction. So the program that I'm in now is 3 years and I just started it. So I'm really excited to have this time to really maybe put some blinders on and really, really get into the meat of the things I want to be talking about in my personal work. And hopefully I can in the future find a way to do both and feel like I'm giving both, the attention they each deserve.
Well, then I'll try to get lessons from you on how to
Yeah.
have a healthier balance between the client work and the work that's for you. I think that sounds fantastic. Good for you for jumping in like that.
Thank you. Yeah, like you said, I don't know if there is a balance. It is really, it is really tough. And
Ongoing dialogue, renegotiation.
exactly, exactly.
I just want to go back to you used the word grotesque, which is a very strong word. And I'm wondering what kinds of responses do you typically get to your work, your personal work that maybe is a little bit more on that grotesque or repellent side? How do people respond to that?
It's definitely a mixed bag. It depends who I'm talking to. I just had one of my first critiques, here at school, and some of the feedback I got was that it's not grotesque enough. Some faculty suggested I get even more into the raw, and they wanted to see maggots and things like that. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, I've had conversations with people who find that they can't really look at taxidermy at all. That seeing an animal mounted like that is disturbing enough, and some of the images I'm making really heighten that. So I find it really interesting to have conversations with lots of different people about about what they're seeing in the images. And right now I'm very sensitive to the fact that people might have vastly different reactions to the images. But I also, I think that anytime anyone has an extreme reaction in either direction, that is success to me. That someone looking at my images would feel something strongly is very exciting and humbling to me. So I'm definitely, totally open to people not liking them. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable reaction. And I hope people are honest with me when they feel that way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, there is a high element of drama too in those photos. So it's not just that they are grotesque or difficult. They're not, I don't find them difficult to look at all. I find both some of the food photographs and the taxidermy photographs are highly dramatic. Very, it's not over the top, but it just, for no reason, but it just made me think of that. There's a very old movie called The Cook, the Thief, His Wife, and Her Lover. And
Yes.
those like really strong colors and dramatic kind of that reminds me a little bit from your photographs.
Oh, that's amazing to hear. That's one of my favorite films of all time.
Oh, cool. Oh, very cool.
Yeah. And I think that the drama that you're talking about, like I often think of that piece of it as, kind of removing these things from reality and kind of making these fantastical worlds within the photos. And I really I really love the fictional aspect of it and the fact that, that they don't feel it doesn't feel like something that's really happening. It feels like a fictional scene. That's really important to me. I think that asking people to sort of experience the photos in sort of this like alternate realm maybe makes it a little bit more engaging or something like that, or kind of enjoyable for me to sort of pull things out of reality and kind of create my own worlds, that kind of thing.
It's kind of interesting too, just from what you said before, also, which is a few decades ago, you could probably go out and see a lot of those animals. Now you can't. So the fiction count has gone up because you're creating worlds that don't really exist anymore, that most young people probably haven't witnessed themselves live out in the world, and you're creating those for them.
I appreciate you saying that. Yeah. And I think another question I'm trying to pose is, did this world ever exist in the first place, or is it all narratives we've constructed, Any way we experience nature is through a narrative screen that we're kind of placing on it.
Even to the point where this is not quite what you're saying, but even to the point where so in Canada, there's like, swaths of untouched, we say untouched land, but it's not like every single piece of land on the planet has been touched by humans in some form or another over the hundreds of thousands of years we've been around. So all that is just one huge story we tell ourselves about the world, that there's pure nature that is out there that we haven't influenced, and that's not true. So creating these stories I love that idea of just like you're just playing with this idea of what we think the natural world is and our place in it, maybe or not. And it's all just a huge fiction that we've written for ourselves.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, that's very good. Okay. Thank you. You're making me think about a lot of things now. I really like what you do here. This is great. Um, so those different themes, so we're talking about these different themes that you explore through your work. What aspects of yourself do you think those themes reveal? What is it about you that you're sharing through your work?
Mm. Yeah, and I think I would have different, I think I might have different answers, in reference to different projects.
Sure.
But since we're talking about the taxidermy, glass eyes stare back, I think I think that, for a long time I've been very preoccupied with these concerns. And I think as someone who, I was growing up in the family I grew up in and where I grew up, there was a huge emphasis on the importance of nature and respecting, the habitats around us. And it was something that I kind of grew up feeling inherently that this is important to me personally and to us. And then moving away and living in big cities, you learn that it's not present all the time all the time. And I think that anytime I hear a piece of climate news, that kind of thing, it's often pretty devastating to me, but I often don't then bring it up at a party later and talk talk through it with friends. So it feels like a lot of my knowledge of what's happening sort of like eats away at me a little bit. And I think that's true for a lot of young people who grew up with this education, from day one, that like these are the bad things that are happening to our ecosystems. So I think making work about this is sort of my putting out my desire to talk about these things more with people. And also I don't think I'm quite here yet, but I hope that it might be able to speak to sort of just like these generational feelings that people in my age group are really feeling more and more urgently. So yeah, that's kind of a big answer to the question. And I think that there's a lot of imagery in this project of Maine and the place where I grew up, where I haven't lived for a really long time, but it feels like such a big part of what I kind of learned about the world is, this place I grew up in, and there's a real sense of place there. So I'm hoping to kind of think through more of what Maine means to me as a place to make work about as well. Yeah.
This might be personal. You don't have to answer, but I'm just curious how your father responds to your work, since it is so connected to his, but in a different way. What are his responses to what you do?
Yeah, I think that, this sort of subject matter is a area where my dad and I connect a lot. And I have always really enjoyed kind of going out in the field with him. And a lot of these ideas are ideas that kind of came out of, a lot of conversations and time spent with him. So he's very proud of me, and I
Nice.
think he likes this work. And he was the person who introduced me to Rosamund Purcell. So he also, is very like interested in sort of artists making work in natural history museums. I think he's always been kind of, into that. So yeah, I think it's a positive thing that we share.
Nice. Nice. I mean, I may be overthinking it, but there's a part of me that just like, because you're so young, and to have as a focus the end of life, the decay, it almost seems like this really sad generational thing where I want to kind of say, no, my generation owns that. Like we have to carry that look because we have made such a mess of it. You should be looking at rose blooms and happy ladybugs. And I'm being I'm being facetious, but there's a part of it that just feels like we failed so badly that this generation now is the one that has to cope with the damage that we've done.
Yeah, I mean, it's okay.
Yes. Oh, darn. Okay.
And that's the thing. It's like, no, it's not any one individual's burden to bear, which is something that I'm always thinking about. It's not my burden to bear, or yours, or it's just, you know, it's um it's just, what's happening. And I also sometimes like love to zoom out a lot and think about the timeline of what we're talking about is pretty short, the last 100 years max, but sometimes I really like to zoom out and think about the history of like the planet and how the climates change. And, who knows where we're at in the scheme of that. And I do think that my generation thinks a lot about kind of like apocalyptic futures, but I'm hoping that we can sort of look at it from a place of like curiosity and being really willing to change and adapt. And like the Hieronymus Bosch Garden of Earthly Delights, I like love that piece. It's a classic piece. And I think so much about like that third panel, which is like, I guess like hell, or like the post, and but it's also like the coolest part of that piece. And there's like a lot of crazy, weird stuff going on. And it's going to be interesting. But I don't think it's all horrible, I guess, as well. Yeah.
I appreciate that mindset. It's almost that scientific, that kind of like, here's what's coming and let's come at it not from a judgmental perspective or a moralistic perspective. Let's just walk into what's coming and see what the opportunities and challenges are going to be and how we're going to work around them.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
This is not really a fair question, but so we talked about the balance between client work and personal work, and now you've started your MA and you've got 3 years in this program. Coming out of there, where do you see that balance? And I'm curious too, because you talked before about your website, and I think a lot of people have this challenge of there are so many different parts of myself. I'm going to look schizophrenic on my website unless I have 14 of them because there's all these different things that I'm trying to share, or but finding those, or how to integrate those pieces together. How do you see that after you finish school?
Yeah, it's a huge question. I think another potentially complicating factor is that, a big reason to go for an MFA is to kind of bolster the teaching component of having an art practice. And that's a big focus of the program I'm in. So I'm going to be teaching classes while I'm in this program. And so now I'm even thinking about, would teaching photography be a part of my professional life as well? And I'm not sure yet. I haven't been able to answer that question. But I really like having a lot of different pots on the stove. I really like doing different things every day. I haven't loved having like full-time jobs in the past where I'm sitting down, at the same time every day, like I really love a lot of variation. So I think realistically speaking, I'll always be juggling a lot. But I'm really hoping that coming out of the program that my personal work will be a significant percentage of what my day-to-day looks like, because up until this point it's really been maybe at best 75% paid work, 25% personal work. And that often means fitting things in the evenings and on weekends and kind of around everything else. So the way I kind of visualize what I hope my future looks like is just having a lot of time that's carved out during regular days to be able to work on personal work. I really love exhibiting. I really love presenting. I think that showing work can be challenging for a lot of artists, and it's definitely very vulnerable for me to do, but I also get a lot of joy and a lot of energy, from having shows and being in group shows and collaborating with people. So having those opportunities in the future, is something that I'm hoping to work toward. And also when I look at, some of the people whose careers I admire who are doing still life photography, I think something really exciting that can happen is that the paid work that you're hired to do hopefully comes out of the personal work you're making. So I do hope to kind of really get to a point where I'm very clear about the type of work I want to be doing, and that it comes from a similar place and a similar motivation, maybe.
I just want to go back for a moment when you said that there are moments when you exhibit and it's a vulnerable time. So you're putting your work out there. And then earlier, though, you said, I think it's great when people respond. They can look at it, they can't look at it. It's okay. I just love the fact that they. So, what part of it is vulnerable for you? What is it that you feel vulnerable about when people look at your work?
Mm. I think it's often I think maybe the vulnerable part is leading up to a show is investing the money into framing photos, which is incredibly expensive. The printing, the framing. I like to print my images big, which is a huge time, financial, and like space consuming thing to do. So, and then, if it's a venue where the piece is for sale, it's not often that something does sell, but kind of having the optimism maybe to kind of do it anyways. So, and then everything that goes with, like doing promotional things, to say I'm having a show, come to the opening, like some of those more administrative things can feel quite vulnerable to, explicitly ask people to come look at the things I'm doing. But it's like then seeing them on the wall, is really, and, printing something as big as I think of it being in my head, that's like a really exciting and feels like a really important exercise for me. And I also love, thinking about, how I'm looking to the side because I have some photos on the wall over here, but thinking about how two photos look next to each other and making those editing choices and kind of creating the narrative between the photos as well as within each photo. Like that all feels like a really important part of it for me.
Thank you so much, Em. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sarah. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, you too. Bye.
Bye.